You are an erasable being. Right now, somewhere in the United States, a patient is lying on a gurney and staring at the sterile white ceiling of an operating room, making nervous small talk with a nurse, perhaps imagining a distant beach or a quiet evening sky, anything to keep the mind from circling the fact that in a few seconds, they will simply stop existing. A clear liquid slips into their foreline, and a faint coolness spreads from the crease of their elbow up through the arm, across the chest, and into the skull. Then, in roughly 10 seconds, consciousness collapses. Not gradually, not gently, not the way sleep sneaks up on you at the end of a long day. This is an abrupt annihilation. One instant you are a person with a name, a history, a sense of self. The next instant you are nothing, nowhere, no one. And the strangest part is that when you return, minutes or hours later, you will have no memory of the gap to your subjective experience. The moment the anesthesiologist pushed the plunger, and the moment you heard a recovery room voice saying, "It's all over," will feel like the same moment, separated by zero time. Your body aged. The clock moved. The surgeon opened and closed and sutured. But you were gone. Where did you go? That question is not merely poetic. It strikes at the deepest unsolved problem in all of science. What is consciousness? And how can a chemical compound in a syringe delete it? Every year, more than 300 million people worldwide undergo surgery requiring general anesthesia, according to data published in The Lancet. In the United States alone, an estimated 60 million anesthetic procedures are performed annually. Each one of those procedures is a miniature experiment in the erasure and restoration of a human self. And yet, after more than 175 years of clinical use, no scientist on Earth can fully explain how anesthetic drugs extinguish awareness. We understand more about the interior of distant neutron stars than we do about what happens inside a human skull when propofol hits the bloodstream. This is the story of that mystery, how it began, what we have learned, what we still do not know, and what it reveals about the fragile, flickering phenomenon we call you. On October 16, 1846, a Boston dentist named William Thomas Green Morton walked into the surgical amphitheater of Massachusetts General Hospital carrying a glass inhaler filled with diethyl ether. The patient, a printer named Edward Gilbert Abbott, had a vascular tumor on the left side of his neck. The surgeon, John Collins Warren, one of the most respected physicians in America, stood ready with his scalpel. A crowd of skeptical medical students and doctors filled the gallery seats above. Morton held the inhaler to Abbott's face and instructed him to breathe. Within minutes, Abbott's eyes closed and his muscles relaxed. Warren made his incision. Abbott did not scream. He did not flinch. When the operation was over and Abbott was roused, he reported that he had felt no pain, only a sensation like having his neck scratched with a blunt instrument. Warren turned to the stunned audience and uttered a sentence that would echo through the history of medicine. "Gentlemen, this is no humbug." News of the demonstration rocketed across the Atlantic within weeks. In London, in Paris, in Vienna, surgeons repeated the experiment with the same miraculous result. An editorial in a Boston medical journal captured the mood, pain. The oldest companion of the surgeon's knife had been conquered. The date came to be known as Ether Day, and the amphitheater at Massachusetts General, still preserved as a historical landmark, is called the Ether Dome. But the triumph of Ether Day carried inside it a confession of ignorance. Morton knew ether worked. He did not know why. Nobody did. Ether is a volatile organic solvent, a simple molecule of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. How does inhaling its vapor cause a living brain to shut down its owner's entire subjective universe? Morton had no answer. Neither did Warren. Neither did the generations of chemists and physiologists who followed them. Over the next several decades, other anesthetic agents arrived. Chloroform, popularized in the United Kingdom in the late 1840s, nitrous oxide, which had actually been experimented with before ether, but had failed in its first public trial, and eventually the synthetic intravenous and inhalational agents of the 20th century. Each new drug worked reliably. Each new drug remained fundamentally unexplained. The ether discovery had deep roots. For centuries before 1846, human civilizations had searched for ways to dull pain during medical procedures. Ancient Egyptian papyri describe the use of opium and mandrake root as sedatives. Indian and Chinese medical traditions employed alkaloid-bearing plants such as belladonna and datura. In the early 1500s, the Swiss-German physician Paracelsus, born Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, observed that chickens exposed to a substance he called sweet oil of vitriol, later identified as diethyl ether, fell into a deep and reversible stupor. He noted its analgesic properties, yet more than 300 years would pass before anyone thought to use ether on a surgical patient. In 1799, the young English chemist Humphrey Davy, working at the Pneumatic Institution in Bristol, conducted a famous series of self-experiments with nitrous oxide. He inhaled large quantities of the gas, recorded the resulting euphoria and laughter, and wrote in his published account that it appears capable of destroying physical pain, and may probably be used with advantage during surgical operations in which no great effusion of blood takes place. It was a prescient observation, but the medical establishment ignored it. Instead, nitrous oxide became a party drug, inhaled at fashionable laughing gas frolics in drawing rooms across England and America. The gap between Davy's insight and its clinical application would stretch nearly half a century. In 1844, a Connecticut dentist named Horace Wells attended one of these laughing gas demonstrations in Hartford. He noticed that a volunteer who had injured his leg while under the influence of nitrous oxide seemed to feel no pain from the wound. Wells immediately saw the surgical potential. He arranged a public demonstration at Massachusetts General Hospital in January 1845, attempting to extract a tooth from a patient while the man breathed nitrous oxide. Something went wrong. The gas was administered improperly, or the dose was too low, and the patient cried out during the extraction. The audience booed and hissed. "Humbug," they shouted. Wells left Boston humiliated. Less than 2 years later, Morton, who had been Wells's student and business partner, succeeded with ether in the same amphitheater where Wells had failed. The cruel irony was not lost on Wells, who descended into depression and eventually addiction. He died in a New York City jail cell in 1848 at the age of 33, a suicide. The practical success of anesthesia raced far ahead of theoretical understanding. By the end of the 19th century, two scientists working independently, Hans Meyer, a pharmacologist in Germany, and Charles Ernest Overton, a British-born researcher working in Switzerland, made an observation that seemed to bring the mechanism of anesthesia within reach. They discovered that the potency of an anesthetic agent correlates remarkably well with its solubility in olive oil, a stand-in for the fatty lipid membranes that surround every cell in the body. The more easily a substance dissolves in oil, the more powerful an anesthetic it is. This relationship, known as the Meyer-Overton correlation, held true across an enormous range of chemically diverse compounds, from simple gases like xenon and nitrous oxide to complex organic molecules like chloroform and halothane, spanning several orders of magnitude in potency. It was one of the tedious relationships in all of pharmacology. The Meyer-Overton correlation led to what became known as the lipid theory of anesthesia, the idea that anesthetic molecules dissolve into the lipid bilayer of nerve cell membranes, physically expand or disrupt those membranes, and thereby interfere with the electrical signaling that neurons use to communicate. For decades, this theory seemed satisfying. It explained why so many structurally unrelated chemicals could all produce the same result. It explained the oil solubility correlation, and it offered a simple, mechanistic picture of how a drug could silence the brain. But the lipid theory had problems. Experiments in the late 20th century, using increasingly precise biophysical techniques, showed that clinical concentrations of anesthetics produce almost negligible changes in the physical properties of lipid membranes. A 2017 study from Hugh Hemmings's laboratory at Weill Cornell Medicine, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, demonstrated that chemically diverse general anesthetics at clinical concentrations minimally affect lipid bilayer properties. The membrane changes were far too small to explain the dramatic loss of consciousness that anesthetics produce. Something else had to be going on. By the 1980s and 1990s, advances in molecular biology and electrophysiology shifted the focus from lipid membranes to specific protein targets embedded, within those membranes. Researchers discovered that anesthetic molecules do not merely float around in the fatty sea of the cell membrane. They bind to particular pockets on particular proteins, especially the proteins that form ion channels, tiny tunnels through the cell membrane that allow charged atoms, or ions, to flow in and out of nerve cells, generating the electrical signals that are the currency of brain activity. The most important of these protein targets turned out to be the GABA-A receptor, a chloride ion channel that is the brain's primary mechanism for putting the brakes on neural activity. GABA, which stands for gamma-aminobutyric acid, is the main inhibitory neurotransmitter in the mammalian brain. When GABA binds to a GABA-A receptor on the surface of a neuron, the receptor's ion channel opens and allows negatively charged chloride ions to flood into the cell. This influx of negative charge makes the neuron's interior more negative, a process called hyperpolarization, which makes the neuron less likely to fire an electrical impulse. In other words, GABA calms neurons down. It is the brain's built-in tranquilizer. The GABA-A receptor is a complex molecular machine assembled from 5 protein subunits, typically 2 alpha subunits, 2 beta subunits, and 1 gamma subunit. Chosen from a menu of 19 possible subunit variants: alpha, 1 through alpha 6, beta, 1 through beta 3, gamma, 1 through gamma 3, and several others. Different combinations of subunits produce GABA-A receptors with different properties and different distributions across brain regions, which is one reason different anesthetic drugs can have subtly different clinical profiles. Propofol, the milky white intravenous drug that is by far the most commonly used general anesthetic in the United States and worldwide, works primarily by binding to a specific site at the interface between the alpha and beta subunits of the GABA-A receptor. When propofol occupies this binding site, it dramatically enhances the effect of GABA. The chloride channel stays open longer, more chloride floods in, and the neuron becomes deeply inhibited. At higher concentrations, propofol can even open the chloride channel directly, without any GABA present at all. The result is a massive increase in inhibitory signaling throughout the brain. Propofol also reduces cerebral blood flow and metabolic rate, providing a degree of neuroprotection during surgery, but also carrying risks. Even a small miscalculation in dosing can push a patient from light sedation into dangerously deep anesthesia. And propofol's suppressive effects on cardiovascular function require constant vigilance. This is the drug that was implicated in the death of the pop star Michael Jackson in 2009, when his personal physician administered it without proper monitoring equipment. Inhalational anesthetics like sevoflurane and isoflurane, the fluorinated ethers that patients breathe through a mask in the operating room, also enhance GABA-A receptor function, though they additionally act on other molecular targets, including 2-pordomain potassium channels and voltage-gated sodium channels. Sevoflurane's activation of potassium channels reduces neuronal excitability in parietal association areas, weakening the bottom-up flow of sensory information, while its enhancement of GABAergic inhibition suppresses the activity of pyramidal neurons in the frontal cortex, diminishing the top-down signals that normally integrate conscious experience. Not all anesthetics work through GABA. Ketamine, a dissociative anesthetic developed in the 1960s and still widely used in emergency rooms and veterinary clinics, operates through a fundamentally different mechanism. Instead of enhancing inhibition, ketamine blocks excitation. Its primary target is the NMDA receptor, an ion channel that responds to glutamate, the brain's main excitatory neurotransmitter. NMDA receptors are crucial for learning, memory formation, and synaptic plasticity, the ability of neural connections to strengthen or weaken over time. When ketamine plugs into a specific binding site inside the NMDA receptor channel, it prevents calcium ions from flowing into the neuron, damping down the cell's excitatory response. The clinical experience of ketamine anesthesia is strikingly different from propofol anesthesia. Patients under ketamine often enter a bizarre dissociative state in which they may have vivid hallucinations, out-of-body experiences, or a sense of floating in a void. Their eyes may remain open. They may appear awake, yet be profoundly unresponsive to pain. This dissociative quality arises because ketamine does not simply turn the brain off. It scrambles the normal balance between excitation and inhibition in complex ways. And some of ketamine's metabolites activate EMPA receptors, another class of glutamate receptors, which trigger distinct neural pathways. Nitrous oxide and xenon, a noble gas that has been explored as an anesthetic, also act primarily on NMDA receptors rather than GABA receptors. So we know that propofol boosts GABA inhibition. We know that ketamine blocks NMDA excitation. We know that sevoflurane acts on multiple channel types. These are important pieces of the puzzle. But they do not solve it. The hard question remains. Why does enhancing inhibition or blocking excitation at the molecular level cause the total disappearance of subjective experience? Turning down neuronal activity is not the same thing as erasing a self. You can sedate someone with a low dose of a benzodiazepine, a drug that also enhances GABA function, and they will become drowsy and relaxed. But they will still be conscious, still experiencing the world, still recognizably themselves. Push the dose higher and they will fall asleep, but even in sleep, consciousness is not fully gone. People dream, they can be awakened by a loud noise. They cycle through complex stages of brain activity. General anesthesia is qualitatively different. It is not sleep. The distinction matters enormously, and getting it wrong can be dangerous. Sleep is an active, cyclical, internally regulated process controlled by a network of brain regions including the hypothalamus, the ventrolateral preoptic area, the brainstem reticular formation, and the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which serves as the body's master circadian clock. During a normal night's sleep, the brain cycles through stages in a predictable pattern roughly every 90 minutes. Non-REM sleep has 3 stages, progressing from light drowsiness, characterized by alpha waves and theta waves on an EEG, through deeper stages marked by sleep spindles, K-complexes, and eventually the slow, rolling delta waves of deep slow-wave sleep. During deep non-REM sleep, body temperature drops, heart rate slows, and the brain engages in essential maintenance tasks, including the clearance of metabolic waste products and the consolidation of memories. Then comes REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, during which the EEG paradoxically resembles the pattern of wakefulness. Fast, low amplitude, desynchronized activity. The eyes dart beneath closed lids. The large skeletal muscles are paralyzed to prevent the dreamer from acting out dreams. And the subjective experience of dreaming, sometimes vivid, sometimes bizarre, sometimes terrifyingly real, indicates that consciousness, or something very like it, is still flickering inside the skull. General anesthesia obliterates all of this. When propofol enters the bloodstream, it does not gently coax the brain down the staircase of sleep stages. It blows the staircase up. Within seconds, the EEG pattern transforms dramatically. First, beta activity, the fast, low-amplitude waves associated with alert wakefulness, drops away. Then a distinctive pattern emerges, high-amplitude alpha oscillations, normally seen over the back of the head during relaxed wakefulness, migrate forward to dominate the frontal cortex, a phenomenon neuroscientists call anteriorization. Simultaneously, slow-wave delta activity surges. The combination of frontal alpha and widespread delta is a signature unique to propofol anesthesia. It does not occur in any natural stage of sleep. As the anesthetic deepens, the brain may enter a state called burst suppression, in which brief flurries of electrical activity alternate with long stretches of near-total silence, flat, featureless traces on the EEG that represent something close to the electrical death of the cortex, interrupted by occasional spasms of firing. At the deepest levels of anesthesia, even the bursts disappear, and the EEG goes entirely flat. Isoelectric. No oscillations. No espindes. No dreams. No one home. The contrast with sleep could not be starker. Sleep preserves the architecture of consciousness. Anesthesia demolishes it. Clinically, the depth of anesthesia is assessed through a combination of EEG monitoring and physical signs. Anesthesiologists watch for the disappearance of the pupillary light reflex, the normal constriction of the pupil in response to a bright light, and the absence of defensive reflexes such as gagging, coughing, or withdrawal from a painful stimulus. Respiration stops or becomes insufficient, requiring mechanical ventilation. Heart rate and blood pressure are maintained within safe ranges through careful titration of the anesthetic drug along with adjunct medications. This state superficially resembles a coma, a pathological state of deep unconsciousness caused by severe brain injury, stroke, or metabolic catastrophe, but with one crucial difference. Anesthesia is reversible by design. When the anesthesiologist stops the propofol drip or turns off the sevoflurane vaporizer, the drug is metabolized and eliminated from the brain within minutes, and consciousness returns. Coma, by contrast, reflects structural damage to neural circuits and may last days, weeks, or years, with no guarantee of recovery. Anesthesia is engineered unconsciousness, consciousness with an on-off switch. If anesthesia is not sleep, and it is not coma, then what is it doing to the brain at the network level? This question has driven an explosion of neuroimaging research over the past 2 decades, and the emerging picture is both fascinating and humbling. The answer, it turns out, is not simply that anesthesia quiets the brain. The brain under anesthesia is not silent. Individual neurons continue to fire. Local circuits remain active. What changes is the way distant brain regions communicate with each other. Anesthesia shatters the long-range connections that knit the brain into a unified, integrated whole. The human brain can be understood as a network of networks, a vast web of roughly 86 billion neurons, each connected to thousands of others through an estimated 100 trillion synapses. Within this web, neuroscientists have identified several large-scale networks whose coordinated activity is consistently associated with particular aspects of cognition and consciousness. 2 of these networks are especially important for understanding anesthesia. The first is the default mode network, or DMN, a constellation of brain regions, including the posterior cingulate cortex, the medial prefrontal cortex, the precuneus, and the angular gyrus, that becomes active when a person is not focused on any external task, but is instead engaged in introspection, daydreaming, mind-wandering, or self-referential thought. The DMN is sometimes described as the network of the self. It lights up when you think about who you are, recall autobiographical memories, or imagine your own future. The second is the frontoparietal network, or FPN, which spans the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the posterior parietal cortex, and is involved in executive function, attention, working memory, and conscious decision-making. The FPN is sometimes described as the brain's control tower. It monitors, selects, and directs the flow of information across the cortex. In the conscious, waking brain, the DMN and FPN are in constant, dynamic conversation, along with sensory networks, the salience network, and subcortical structures like the thalamus. Information flows both bottom-up from sensory regions to higher-order cortices and top-down from frontal executive regions back down to sensory and parietal areas. This bidirectional traffic is critical. Bottom-up signals carry raw sensory data, photons hitting the retina, sound waves vibrating the eardrum, while top-down signals carry predictions, expectations, and contextual interpretations that shape how that raw data is consciously experienced. The integration of bottom-up and top-down information, coordinated across the frontoparietal axis, is believed by many researchers to be the very mechanism by which unified conscious experience arises. General anesthesia disrupts this integration. A landmark review published in 2025 in the journal Current Neuropharmacology synthesized over a decade of fMRI and EEG studies examining frontoparietal connectivity under anesthesia. The authors performed a meta-analysis of 6 studies encompassing 97 participants and found a statistically significant reduction in anterior-posterior connectivity during anesthesia compared to wakefulness, with a pooled mean difference of 1.04 and high statistical significance. The effect was consistent across different anesthetic agents: propofol, sevoflurane, isoflurane, ketamine, dexmedetomidine, and remimazolam, despite the fact that these drugs act on entirely different molecular targets. Propofol enhances GABA. Ketamine blocks NMDA. Yet both produce the same network-level signature, a severing of the functional bridge between frontal and parietal cortices. The review concluded that various anesthetics cause loss of consciousness by interrupting the connections between the parietal and frontal lobes, and that this disruption of frontoparietal connectivity represents a common neurophysiological correlate of general anesthesia. The details of how this disconnection unfolds are illuminating. EEG studies using techniques like directed transfer entropy and dynamic causal modeling have shown that anesthesia preferentially impairs feedback connections, the top-down signals running from frontal cortex back to parietal and sensory cortices, while relatively preserving feed-forward connections, the bottom-up sensory signals running in the opposite direction. In other words, the raw data of the senses may still arrive at the brain's doorstep, but the executive system that normally interprets, integrates, and makes meaning out of that data has been disconnected. The lights are on, but the interpreter is gone. This finding aligns elegantly with the global neuronal workspace theory of consciousness, developed by the French neuroscientist Stanislas Dehaene and the Dutch-American cognitive scientist Bernard Bars, which proposes that consciousness arises when sensory information crosses a threshold of neural activation and is broadcast widely across a distributed network of prefrontal and parietal neurons, the global workspace. When this broadcast is disrupted, as it is under anesthesia, the information remains local and unconscious. It never achieves the wide distribution that constitutes awareness. At the cellular level, a remarkable mechanism underlying this network disconnection was identified in a 2022 study published in Neuron by a team led by Botan Roska at the Institute of Molecular and Clinical Ophthalmology in Basel, Switzerland. The researchers found that general anesthetics, regardless of their specific molecular targets, consistently and selectively synchronized the activity of layer 5 cortical pyramidal neurons, the large output neurons of the cerebral cortex that send long-range projections to distant brain areas. The transitions into and out of consciousness during anesthesia closely corresponded with the onset and cessation of this abnormal synchronous activity in layer 5. Furthermore, other research has shown that anesthetics cause dendrosomatic decoupling in these pyramidal neurons. The signals traveling from the distal dendrites, the branching input structures of the neuron, to the cell body, the soma, are disrupted. Since the distal dendrites are where top-down feedback signals from higher cortical areas arrive, this decoupling effectively cuts off the neuron from the higher-order contextual information that normally guides its output. The cortical column loses its connection to the broader network. The result is a brain that is locally active but globally fragmented, a collection of isolated islands of neural firing with no overarching coordination. This fragmentation is not merely a metaphor. Lewis and colleagues, recording simultaneously from single neurons and local field potentials in the human cortex, found that during propofol-induced unconsciousness, slow oscillations emerge in the local field potential, and neurons fire only within narrow phase windows of these local oscillations, remaining silent the rest of the time. Crucially, these slow oscillations are desynchronized across different cortical regions. They are not locked in step the way normal brain rhythms are during wakefulness. The result is temporal and spatial functional fragmentation that disrupts cortical information. Integration. Each patch of cortex is doing its own thing, on its own schedule, disconnected from every other patch. The unified symphony of the waking brain has been replaced by a cacophony of isolated soloists, playing in different keys and different tempos. In 2024, a team of neuroscientists at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, led by Earl K. Miller and Isla Feet, published a study in Neuron that reframed the mechanism of propofol-induced unconsciousness in a surprising way. The conventional assumption had been that propofol, by boosting inhibition through GABA receptors, simply quiets the brain, turns down the volume until the signal fades to silence. Miller and Feet's team found the opposite. Using a novel analytical technique called delay embedding to measure the dynamic stability of neural activity in multiple cortical areas, they discovered that propofol does not stabilize the brain, it destabilizes it. In the normal waking state, the brain operates in a regime of dynamic stability. Neurons are excitable enough to respond to inputs, but the system quickly returns to its baseline after each perturbation. Under propofol, this recovery fails. After each input, neural activity takes longer and longer to return to baseline. remaining in an overly excited state. As the drug accumulates, the instability escalates until the entire system tips over into chaos and consciousness collapses. The paradox is striking. A drug that increases inhibition produces instability, not calm. Miller and Feet explain this through a mechanism called disinhibition. When propofol enhances the inhibitory drive of GABAergic interneurons, those interneurons inhibit other inhibitory interneurons. The net effect is that some excitatory neurons are released from their normal restraint, leading to an overall increase in brain activity that is uncoordinated and self-amplifying. The brain has to operate on this knife's edge between excitability and chaos, Miller said. It's got to be excitable enough for its neurons to influence one another. But if it gets too excitable, it spins off into chaos. Propofol seems to disrupt the mechanisms that keep the brain in that narrow operating range. In 2026, the same research group followed up with a study showing that 3 different anesthetic drugs, despite acting on completely different molecular receptors, all produce the same destabilization signature in neural dynamics, suggesting that dynamic instability may be a universal mechanism by which anesthetics of all kinds extinguish consciousness. If confirmed, this finding could transform the practice of anesthesiology by enabling a single monitoring system that works for all anesthetic drugs, rather than requiring separate protocols for each one. Beneath the network level and the cellular level, there is another layer to the mystery, a layer that takes us into deeper conceptual territory. What, exactly, is the thing that anesthesia erases? What is consciousness? The question sounds philosophical, and it is. But it is also an empirical question that modern neuroscience is beginning to answer with real data. 2 major theoretical frameworks dominate the scientific study of consciousness today, and both have been profoundly influenced by research on anesthesia. The first is the global neuronal workspace theory, or GNW, which proposes that consciousness arises when a piece of information, a sensory percept, a thought, a memory, crosses a threshold of activation and is ignited into a widespread neural broadcast across the prefrontal and parietal cortices. Below that threshold, information is processed unconsciously by local, specialized brain modules. Above it, the information enters the global workspace and becomes available for report, for memory encoding, for voluntary action, in short, for all the things we associate with conscious awareness. GNW draws an analogy to a darkened theater. Unconscious processing is like the many activities happening backstage, invisible to the audience. Conscious processing is like a spotlight illuminating one actor on stage, making that actor visible to every seat in the house. The frontoparietal network serves as the stage and the spotlight. The broadcast to the entire audience is what makes the information conscious. GNW predicts that anesthesia should disrupt consciousness by preventing the ignition from occurring, by keeping information trapped in local modules, never reaching the global workspace, and this prediction is strongly supported by the neuroimaging data showing frontoparietal disconnection under anesthesia. The second framework is integrated information theory, or IIT, developed by the neuroscientist Giulio Tononi at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. IIT takes a radically different starting point. Instead of asking what brain processes give rise to consciousness, IIT asks what properties a system must have in order to be conscious. Its answer: a system is conscious to the extent that it possesses integrated information, quantified by a mathematical measure called phi. Phi is high when a system is both highly differentiated, capable of being in a very large number of distinct states, and highly integrated. Each part of the system is richly interconnected with every other part, such that the whole system is more than the sum of its parts. A system with high phi, according to IIT, is conscious. A system with zero phi is not. The theory predicts that consciousness should be associated with posterior cortical hot zones, the parietal, temporal, and occipital regions where the brain's neural architecture achieves maximal integration and differentiation, and that anesthesia should reduce phi by breaking apart the integrated network into disconnected fragments. Empirical evidence supports elements of both theories. A 2025 study published in Neuroscience of Consciousness examined changes in phi during anesthesia and sleep using fMRI data and reported that integrated information decreased significantly during both states, with particularly pronounced reductions in the default mode network. The reduction of phi was concentrated not in the frontoparietal broadcaster regions emphasized by GNW, but in the DMN regions that serve as the brain's self-referential gateway, suggesting that the loss of consciousness during anesthesia may be triggered by the closing of this gateway, preventing self-related information from reaching the workspace for broadcast. This finding hints that GNW and IIT, though they approach the problem from different angles, may be describing complementary aspects of the same underlying process. GNW describes how information is shared, while IIT describes how much information is available to be shared. When anesthesia degrades both the sharing mechanism and the quantity of integrated information, consciousness vanishes. Scientists have also developed practical tools for measuring the presence or absence of consciousness in clinical settings, which is critical for patients who cannot report their own experience, such as those under anesthesia, in a coma, or in a vegetative state. One of the most promising is the Perturbational Complexity Index, or PCI, developed by Marcello Massimini and his colleagues. PCI works by delivering a brief magnetic pulse to the cortex using transcranial magnetic stimulation, and then measuring the complexity of the resulting electrical response using high-density EEG. In a conscious brain, the pulse triggers a complex, spatially distributed cascade of activity that reverberates across multiple brain regions. In an unconscious brain, whether due to anesthesia, deep sleep, or severe brain injury, the response is either simple and local, indicating that the pulse's effect did not spread, or globally synchronized and stereotyped, indicating that the brain cannot generate differentiated responses. PCI has been shown to reliably distinguish conscious from unconscious states across a wide range of conditions, with values consistently dropping during general anesthesia and recovering upon awakening. A 2024 study published in Nature Communications showed that measures of critical brain dynamics derived from spontaneous EEG predict anesthetic-induced unconsciousness, further supporting the idea that consciousness depends on the brain maintaining a specific, finely tuned dynamical regime, neither too stable nor too chaotic, that anesthesia destroys. While the mainstream of anesthesia research focuses on ion channels, synaptic receptors, and large-scale neural networks, a controversial but increasingly discussed hypothesis proposes that the deepest secrets of consciousness and anesthesia may lie at the quantum level. This is the orchestrated objective reduction theory, or orchestra, proposed in the mid-1990s by the mathematical physicist Sir Roger Penrose and the anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff. Orchestra, suggests that consciousness arises from quantum computations occurring inside microtubules, tiny protein tubes made of a protein called tubulin that form the structural scaffolding inside every neuron. Microtubules are part of the cytoskeleton, the internal framework that gives cells their shape and serves as the highway system for intracellular transport. According to Orchestra, tubulin subunits within microtubules can exist in quantum superposition, simultaneously occupying multiple states at once, and these quantum states become entangled across many microtubules in many neurons, forming a macroscopic quantum state that constitutes the physical substrate of unified conscious experience. When this quantum state undergoes objective reduction, a specific form of wave function collapse, governed by the geometry of spacetime, a moment of conscious awareness occurs. Anesthetics, in this framework, disrupt consciousness by binding to hydrophobic pockets within tubulin and disrupting the delicate quantum coherence of the microtubule system. A 2025 paper by Travis Craddock, published under the title Old Theory, New Evidence in Neuroscience of Consciousness, reviewed multiple lines of experimental evidence supporting the microtubule hypothesis. The paper highlighted several empirical facts that are difficult to explain under the conventional ion channel model. The Meyer-Overton correlation, the remarkably tight relationship between anesthetic potency and oil solubility that has puzzled scientists for over a century, can be reproduced by quantum chemical models, assuming that anesthetics bind to delocalized electron sites within tubulin, but cannot be reproduced by any single ion channel model. The approximately linear additivity of anesthetic effects, The fact that half a dose of one anesthetic plus half a dose of a completely different anesthetic, even one that acts on different ion channels, produces a full dose of unconsciousness, is predicted by a single target model, but is difficult to reconcile with a multi-target model involving different ion channels. The paper also cited a 2024 experiment by Sana Khan and colleagues, published in eNeuro, which demonstrated that rats treated with the brain-penetrating microtubule-stabilizing drug opotholone took significantly longer to lose consciousness under isoflurane anesthesia. The effect size was large, with a Cohen's d value of 1.9, and the average delay was 69 seconds. This result directly supports the hypothesis that isoflurane causes unconsciousness, at least in part, by acting on microtubules. Additional experimental evidence has emerged from biophysics laboratories. Researchers have demonstrated quantum optical effects, specifically quantum superradiance, in microtubules at room temperature, and these effects were enhanced when microtubules were joined into larger structures. A series of experiments by Anirban Bandyopadhyay's group showed microtubule resonance states, spanning across multiple neurons and controlling membrane voltage. Another group used a novel quantum entanglement detection method in a human MRI scanner and reported evidence of a macroscopic entangled brain state that correlated with the conscious state and with working memory performance. Furthermore, quantum optical effects in microtubules were shown to be dampened by inhalational anesthetics, directly supporting the hypothesis that anesthesia works by disrupting quantum coherence in the cytoskeleton. However, the quantum consciousness hypothesis remains intensely controversial. The central objection, raised most influentially by the physicist Max Tegmark in 2000, is that the brain is far too warm and wet for quantum coherence to survive long enough to play any functional role. Thermal noise at body temperature should destroy quantum superpositions in femtoseconds, trillionths of a trillionth of a second, long before they could influence neural activity on the timescale of milliseconds that is relevant for cognition. Defenders of orchestra or counter that Tegmark's calculations assumed thermal equilibrium, which is appropriate for a dead system, but not for a living one. Living cells are far from equilibrium systems continuously pumped with metabolic energy. And theoretical models based on the physicist Herbert Froehlich's work on biological condensation states suggest that stable quantum coherence could be maintained under these conditions. The experimental demonstrations of room temperature quantum effects in microtubules lend weight to this counterargument. But the question of whether such effects scale up to the level of whole brain function remains open. It is important to be clear, the quantum consciousness hypothesis is not established science. It is a speculative framework with intriguing supporting evidence, but also significant unresolved challenges. Most neuroscientists continue to work within the classical framework of ion channels, synaptic receptors, and network dynamics. But the quantum hypothesis serves as a valuable reminder that the deepest layers of the anesthesia mystery may not yet be visible to our current theoretical microscopes. Whether the explanation ultimately lies in GABA receptors, frontoparietal disconnection, dynamic instability, quantum microtubules, or some combination of all of these, the phenomenon of general anesthesia has already revealed something profound about the nature of human existence. Consider what anesthesia demonstrates. A few milligrams of a chemical compound, a substance you could hold in the palm of your hand, can delete every aspect of your subjective experience. Your sense of self, your continuity of memory, your awareness of the world, your very existence as a conscious being. And then, when the drug wears off, all of it comes back. You pick up exactly where you left off, as if the gap never happened. The implication is both humbling and exhilarating. You are not a solid, permanent thing. You are a process, a pattern of information flowing through a network of biological circuits, and that process can be paused and restarted like software running on a computer. Your sense of being a continuous, unified self persisting through time is, in a very real sense, an illusion constructed by your brain from moment to moment. This insight connects to the theoretical work on discrete moments of consciousness. Research in cognitive neuroscience, drawing on EEG microstate analysis and psychophysical experiments, suggests that consciousness may not be the smooth, continuous stream that it subjectively appears to be. Instead, it may consist of discrete frames or moments, each lasting roughly 100 to 200 milliseconds, stitched together so rapidly that the seams are invisible. The global neuronal workspace theory supports this picture. Each moment of conscious awareness corresponds to a single ignition event in which information is broadcast across the frontoparietal network, and these ignitions succeed each other at rates of approximately 5 to 10 per second. Between ignitions, you are, in a sense, unconscious, or at least not consciously experiencing anything new. The stream of consciousness is a flipbook animation, not a continuous movie. General anesthesia simply stops the flipbook. No more ignitions. No more frames. No more you. This picture of consciousness as a fragile, process-dependent, network-level phenomenon has implications that extend far beyond the operating room. It bears directly on some of the oldest and most contentious questions in philosophy: the nature of personal identity, the existence of free will, and the meaning of the self. If your consciousness can be turned off and on by a chemical, and if you cannot even tell that any time has passed during the gap, then what grounds your identity as a person? Is the you who wakes up after surgery the same you who went under? The atoms in your body are the same. The neural connections are the same. The memories are the same. But the continuity of experience, the subjective thread that seemed to connect one moment to the next, was severed and respliced. If identity depends on continuity of consciousness, then the person who wakes up is arguably a new person, one who merely inherits the memories and personality of the person who was erased. This sounds like a philosopher's parlor game, but it has real clinical consequences. Consider the problem of intraoperative awareness, the nightmarish scenario in which a patient regains some degree of consciousness during surgery, but is paralyzed by neuromuscular blocking drugs and unable to signal distress. Estimates suggest this occurs in roughly 1 to 2 cases per 1,000 general anesthetics in the United States, which translates to tens of thousands of cases per year. Patients who experience intraoperative awareness often suffer lasting psychological trauma, including post-traumatic stress disorder. The phenomenon underscores the fact that we lack a reliable, real-time, fully accurate measure of whether a patient is truly unconscious. The EEG-based monitors currently in use, such as the bispectral index, provide useful but imperfect estimates. A deeper understanding of the neural mechanisms of consciousness and anesthesia could lead to monitoring systems that are far more precise, reducing the risk of both awareness and excessive anesthesia depth. The question of consciousness also connects to the challenge of determining brain death and caring for patients with disorders of consciousness. Some patients who appear to be in a vegetative state, eyes open, sleep-wake cycles preserved, but no apparent awareness, have been shown, through fMRI and EEG techniques, to retain islands of conscious awareness that are invisible to bedside examination. The same tools developed to measure consciousness under anesthesia, the perturbational complexity index, measures of integrated information, analyses of frontoparietal connectivity, are now being applied to these patients, with the potential to revolutionize diagnosis and guide treatment decisions. If consciousness is a network property that can be detected through its signatures in brain dynamics, then we may be able to identify and even restore it in patients previously believed to be irreversibly unconscious. Looking further ahead, the mystery of anesthesia connects to the challenge of artificial intelligence. If consciousness arises from the integration of information across a complex network, as IIT proposes, then what about artificial neural networks? Current AI systems process staggering amounts of information, but do so in architectures that are fundamentally different from the brain's. Could a sufficiently complex, sufficiently integrated artificial system become conscious? IIT provides a framework for asking this question quantitatively. Calculate the system's phi, and you have your answer. Most current AI architectures, built on feed-forward processing with relatively limited recurrence, would score very low on phi and would be predicted to be unconscious regardless of their behavioral sophistication. But future architectures, designed with high integration and recurrence in mind, might be a different story. The lessons of anesthesia, which teaches us exactly what physical conditions are necessary for consciousness to be present and what conditions cause it to disappear, could inform the design of artificial systems that are either deliberately made conscious or deliberately kept unconscious. The philosophical dimension deepens when we consider free will. If consciousness is a physical phenomenon produced by network dynamics and chemical interactions, and if that phenomenon can be switched off and on by a syringe of propofol, then what becomes of the feeling that you are the author of your own decisions? The MIT study on dynamic stability showed that propofol disrupts the brain's ability to maintain the delicate balance between excitability and control. When that balance is lost, not only does consciousness disappear, but so does any capacity for voluntary action. The patient under general anesthesia cannot choose, cannot decide, cannot will anything. Free will, whatever it is, depends on the same neural substrate that produces consciousness. When the substrate is disrupted, both disappear together. When the substrate is restored, both return together. This does not definitively prove that free will is an illusion. The question is far more nuanced than that, but it does demonstrate that the experience of free agency is intimately tied to specific physical conditions in the brain. Conditions that can be pharmacologically manipulated. The quantum hypothesis adds another twist to this reflection. If Penrose and Hameroff are correct that consciousness involves quantum processes in microtubules, then the brain is not a purely deterministic machine. Quantum mechanics introduces a fundamental element of indeterminacy at the most basic level of physical reality. The outcome of a quantum measurement is inherently probabilistic. It cannot be predicted with certainty, even in principle. If this quantum indeterminacy propagates up through the microtubule system to influence neural activity and thereby influence behavior, then there is a genuine sense in which the future is not predetermined by the past, a sense in which the universe, at its most fundamental level, is open to novel outcomes. This is not the same as the common-sense notion of free will, but it is a far cry from the clockwork determinism of classical physics. Anesthesia, by disrupting the quantum coherence of the microtubule system, would in this picture be shutting down not just consciousness, but also the quantum indeterminacy that underlies the open-endedness of human choice. When the drug wears off and quantum coherence is restored, the full range of possibility reopens. All of these reflections converge on a single vertiginous insight. You are far more fragile than you think, and far more remarkable. The fact that a clear liquid in an 4 bag can erase your entire subjective universe in 10 seconds is terrifying. The fact that your subjective universe reassembles itself flawlessly minutes later is miraculous. You are not a thing. You are a process, a shimmering, flickering pattern of information integration, sustained by the electrochemical dance of 86 billion neurons linked by 100 trillion synapses, maintained in a state of dynamic instability, so precarious that a few molecules of propofol can topple it. And yet this process, this fragile flame, produces everything you have ever experienced. Every color you have seen, every song you have heard, every person you have loved, every idea you have had, every memory you cherish. All of it is made of the same stuff, information, integrated and broadcast across a biological network that evolved over hundreds of millions of years to do exactly this. The comparison to cosmology is not gratuitous. Just as the visible matter in the universe, the stars, the planets, the galaxies, accounts for only about 5% of the total mass energy content, with the rest consisting of dark matter and dark energy whose nature remains unknown. The conscious activity of the brain represents only a tiny fraction of total neural processing, with the vast majority occurring below the surface of awareness. Just as dark matter holds galaxies together through gravitational interactions that we can detect but cannot fully explain, the unconscious activity of the brain provides the structural scaffolding that holds conscious experience together, the memories that provide context, the predictions that guide perception, the emotional associations that give meaning to raw sensation, all operating invisibly beneath the spotlight of awareness. And just as a black hole can be described as a region of space-time from which no information can escape, general anesthesia creates a region of time in a person's life from which no information can be retrieved, a temporal black hole in the landscape of personal experience. But unlike a black hole, from which nothing returns, The information of consciousness does return after anesthesia. The analogy is imperfect but suggestive. Consciousness may be subject to laws of conservation and recovery that we are only beginning to glimpse. The journey through the science of anesthesia is ultimately a journey into the deepest question any conscious being can ask. What am I? The answer that emerges from 175 years of research is provisional, incomplete, and profoundly humbling. You are a network. You are an integration. You are a broadcast. You are a balance on a knife's edge. You are a process that can be paused by a chemical and restarted by the absence of that chemical. You are robust enough to survive millions of surgical procedures and fragile enough to be erased in 10 seconds. You are, in the most literal and scientifically precise sense of the word, an erasable being. And the fact that you can know this, that you can contemplate your own irasability, that you can stare into the abyss of non-existence and then come back to tell the story, is perhaps the most astonishing thing in the entire universe.